You know, when a new poll comes out and shows their favorite candidate losing, well, some people instinctively respond, oh, the polls never get it right, or you can't possibly tell what's going on in America by just talking to 1,000 people. Other people then, when the poll shows their candidate ahead, they say, well, of course, that poll is very reliable and we know it's telling us the truth. This is a serious issue. I mean, pollsters want to have their election polls accurate, much more difficult than it used to be. Let me give you a sense of scale. Back when I started polling, the big new technology problem was the answering machine. We could no longer just call landlines and expect somebody to pick up because people began to screen their calls. We've come a long way since the 80s, and now we're dealing with cell phones and social media networks and all kinds of other things. And in fact, phone polling itself almost is obsolete because hardly anybody talks on the phone. So these discussions are worthwhile. How do you make sure a poll is accurate? It's something we always want to be focused on. But I worry a little bit that it's distracting us from the biggest problem facing our industry. What's that? Well, most public pollsters ask their questions and interpret the results in the language of a Georgetown cocktail party. That's a language that hardly anybody else speaks. What does it look like? Well, a few years back, a lot of polls came out showing decent amount of Americans said, yeah, I kind of like socialism. My own polling found that it was about 35%. Some conservatives were horrified by that, but turns out that what the voters were saying they liked was not the socialism that we learned about in school. In fact, when we polled people who said they liked socialism, well, hardly any of them thought it had anything to do with economics, and they tended to like free markets rather than a government-managed economy. Only 1 out of 3 people who said they liked socialism thought it had anything to do with giving more power and money to government. In fact, for most people, it was kind of a Tocquevillian sense that decision-making ought to be made closer to home. So the idea that people were liking socialism all depended on how they define socialism. Big challenge here, a lot of conservatives especially, but a lot of people, when they're misunderstood, tend to say, well, we've got to teach those people the right thing. We've got to teach them what socialism means. No. If you are not being understood, the responsibility is always on the person speaking, or in the case of a pollster, the person who is asking the questions. And, you know, words, the meaning of words change. We have to use the words the way they are understood. And just to make the point, look, the term middle-aged means something a lot different to me today than it did 30 years ago. So when we start talking about the language of the American people and thinking about the way the listeners are hearing your words, you begin to look at things differently. Let me give you a totally different example. Imagine that you get a polling question and says, do you believe that Luke 10, 25 to 37 is a good role model for your life? Now, hardly anybody would have any idea what I'm talking about. So they look for clues in the question wording to say yes or no. Some of them would just give up. If I were to reframe that question and say, is the Good Samaritan a good role model? People would overwhelmingly say yes. Why? They know what the Good Samaritan is. You don't have to be a Bible scholar. You don't even have to be a Christian. We have Good Samaritan laws in America. So you're speaking a language, you're asking a question in a way that they understand it. Technically, Luke 10, 25 to 37 and the parable of the Good Samaritan are the same thing. But when you're asking the question, you've got to ask it in the way it would be understood. Now, the problem with that Georgetown cocktail party idea is that it leads to a very false narrative about the American people. Let's go back to the socialism question. You ask people about socialism, and in Washington, you think that means Bernie Sanders or AOC. Then you get a poll that says, wow, 35 or 40% of people embrace socialism. They're just like AOC and Bernie Sanders. It's simply not true. But all of a sudden, there is our narrative taking hold. Now, at my firm, RMG Research, we spend a lot of time asking about words. You know, what does socialism mean? What does woke mean? What does CRT mean? We ask people if they know, and then if they do, we ask them what they think it means. And oftentimes we find that words that are very common in the political realm are just non-existent in America. So if a poll was asking a question about being woke or about CRT, disregard it. Why? Only about 1 out of 7 voters has any idea what you're talking about. Now, if you're a pollster, the message here is go out and listen to the way people speak. Frame your questions in the language of everyday Americans. If you're a consumer of polls, well, in that case, what you want to do when you hear about a poll result or you see a narrative being spun, take a look at the actual questions. If you don't know what the words in the question mean, or if your friends don't, or if it sounds a little weird just the way they're asking it, maybe the problem is not with the answers, it's with the way the question is being asked, and you should simply disregard polls that are asked in the language of a Georgetown cocktail party. Pay attention to narratives that respect the language of everyday Americans. So, Jennifer, what do you think?
I think that I feel a little less dumb now that I've heard you explain that, because I've been on that receiving end of a poll where they read the question and I kind of go, I don't know how to answer this.
But we've also all been in meetings or in rooms where somebody brings something up and you're embarrassed to say you don't know. So you give an answer. And that's where the danger is. Somebody asks a question in one language, you guess at the answer, and then they interpret it like you knew what was going on. That's a big problem for the polling industry. It is the biggest problem our industry faces today.
Interesting. All right, Scott, thank you so much.